Hi team. So today I want to talk about masculinity, what it means to be a man in today's society, the idea of masculinity in general and its complex evolution through time being biased by societal expectations and traditional gender roles. I want to explore some of the new modern redefinitions of the way that people are seeing masculinity, the way that societal norms impact our definition of masculinity and what it means to us, the impact that the media has on all of this, and how embracing diverse and individual expressions of masculinity might lead to healthier and more fulfilling lives. So let's get into it. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Thinking Differently, a podcast designed to take an idea, pull it apart, and challenge the way that we think about it. I'm your host, Andy Franklin, and I'll be your guide through this sometimes wandering journey of exploration, which will hopefully leave you with more questions than answers and a lot to think about. So obviously, disclaimer part first, all of these ideas are my own. I'm not saying any of these are the truth or they have to be your truth. Everybody gets to decide on their own different opinions on all of these things. I feel like masculinity is a very hot topic at the moment, and there is lots of subdivisions of this idea of masculinity, from toxic masculinity to the new development of masculinity. And so everybody has to think and make their own decisions about how they feel about the word and the expression of that. And also specifically with this episode, I'm not really going into the gender debate. I think that's a whole podcast in its own right. And so I won't be talking about masculinity in terms of male and female and talking about gender as such. I'll mainly be talking about the idea of masculinity and the construct that exists around that. And I'm aware that when I'm talking about these things, I am speaking in a binary way about gender, about a male and female, because I'm talking about masculine or feminine. And I am equally aware that there are lots of other places that you can sit on the gender spectrum, which I'm not covering by listing them all out. And that's not a deliberate omission. I think it's the language that we have to describe that's kind of pinning me in a box when I'm talking about this. So with all that being said, let's get into it. So this word masculinity has been thrown around a lot recently. And so I started trying to think about what the word meant for me. So I think the term masculinity is a social construct. It's a shorthand which has diverse meanings across cultures and across generations and time. I think typically masculinity and gender has been interlinked, and the more you get into the nuance of what masculine actually means, I think the more I realize that masculine in itself is just an umbrella term. It's a label, a shorthand, which creates a construct that we can throw lots of words into, and all of those words then fall under the umbrella of masculine. And I think because of that, masculinity has definitely had a massive impact on the way that I define myself and the way that I look at the things that I do in terms of masculine or feminine. So it's definitely shaped my perception of self and my identity. And I think what I'd like to do throughout this episode is pull that apart a little bit and see whether or not that's a legitimate thing to be pinning onto myself as a label. And again, as I said before, I'm not talking about gender here. I think the two things are intrinsically linked in my head, at least, and most people's heads. But I don't think that they are as linked as they used to be within society. And I think that masculine and feminine can be used interchangeably with the gender of the person that you're talking about. But again, most of the time, if you are talking about the opposite, so if you are talking about a male with feminine characteristics or a female with masculine characteristics, it's normally called out as an exception to the rule somehow. And so I guess the first thing that came up for me was, If masculinity and femininity, or masculine and feminine, are just social constructs, then do we even need the words anymore? There's a movement that I've seen online trying to redefine these terms, recategorize different words within certain umbrellas. But to me, if everybody is moving away from the idea that a set of characteristics makes you masculine and a set of characteristics makes you feminine, then do we even need these words as descriptions anymore? Can we just use other words to describe people and not even have this masculine feminine idea as an umbrella, which then confuses things and potentially creates more harm than benefit? So as I said, masculinity isn't a biologically fixed thing. It's definitely shaped by what society expects to be under this umbrella of masculine or feminine. So traditionally, masculine would be things like dominant and powerful and strength and emotional suppression. So when we then considered those terms in relation to an individual, I think you could absolutely describe anybody as having masculine traits or some masculine traits, or in fact, even masculine traits in certain situations, which kind of proves to me that if it's not specifically tied to gender and it's also not really tied to an individual, it's a lot more nuanced than that, then what's the benefit of having these words? And what I'm doing here is, instead of trying to reframe masculinity and femininity as different to the way that our culture sees them today, so rather than saying, I'm feminine and I'm powerful, or I'm masculine and I can be in touch with my emotions, which feels like we're still playing within the framework, but we're trying to change the definition of the word, why don't we just get rid of the word altogether? Because you could absolutely say that a man or a woman is strong, a man or a woman is emotional. Why do they have to be tied in any way to the idea of masculine or feminine? And I think this goes back a really long way. As I said, it's all created by culture and society. Even inanimate objects tend to be seen as masculine or feminine, which again, to me, doesn't make sense. So generally, within the UK, the sun is seen as masculine and the moon is seen as feminine. But in Germany, it's the complete opposite. The sun is feminine and the moon is masculine. In the same way, cars in the UK always tend to be feminine. They tend to be a her. But that doesn't make any sense because they're an inanimate object. They shouldn't have a label. And I guess when I'm trying to think of why these labels exist, potentially it creates a sense of community, it creates a sense of togetherness with people of similar traits. But I think it also creates a sense of otherness if you don't follow all of these traits, if you want to push against those traits of the assumed gender masculine feminine thing. I think historically masculinity has encouraged the gender inequality between males and females. I think it's created a situation which puts an emphasis of benefit on the masculine traits. And I think we can see that kind of moving through the 1950s and onwards through kind of feminism, where the masculine traits were encouraged. And again, by masculine traits, what I'm actually saying is a predefined list of things that society has deemed to be masculine, like strength and power, like dominance, like speaking your mind. If we define masculinity as better than femininity within our society, then of course we're going to have inequality when it comes to that. We are going to see strength and power within business as more important than emotional intelligence, for example. And so as masculinity evolves and as femininity evolves, it feels to me like what a lot of people are doing are saying, I'm going to hold on to this label, but I'm going to redefine the label. So within masculinity, it's about saying masculinity is more about emotional intelligence now, or being vulnerable. Masculinity is now about empathy and cooperation and having solid and healthy relationships. But again, all of those things were under the label of feminine. So if we're redefining masculine as all of the previous traits plus all of these new ones, then aren't we just saying that to be masculine, you can actually adopt any trait that you want? And in the same way, femininity is doing the same thing. And I think that's a brilliant place to start. That's a brilliant place to start talking about things, to say, actually, a single individual trait is not necessarily masculine or feminine, or it can fall into both buckets. But it's better just to not have a masculine or feminine attached to a particular trait, a particular way of being. Why should it be masculine when I'm strong, but feminine when I cry? Why do I have to say I embrace both the masculine and feminine parts of myself, instead of just saying I embrace both being strong and speaking my mind and also being emotionally intelligent? Why do I have to even put a label on those things? And again, the way that society constructs this narrative to keep this narrative playing out starts really, really early. The societal norms are so embedded in our culture that even tiny children are forced into this masculine or feminine camp. So I don't understand why you don't just have gender neutral clothes for children. Children are all the same body shape, so they don't really need anything special. But instead, what you find is that boys' clothes are all either black or blue and all have cars or trains or boats or dinosaurs on them. And girls' clothes are all frilly and colourful and have flowers and fairies and these kind of things. And again, as a child, why does that matter? Why does it matter to any child whether or not they are being seen as masculine or feminine and whether they are wearing boys' clothes or girls' clothes? If they like blue, they should be able to wear blue. If they like orange, they should be able to wear orange. If they like flowers or trains or absolutely anything else. Now, I'm not saying here that there aren't gender differences in children, but I do wonder how much of that is created by society, and how much of it, if we stripped away all of that, would give children, and in fact adults, the ability to express themselves more freely without feeling like they had to be constrained by the way that they're perceived in the world and the way that they're expected to behave based on whether or not they're masculine or feminine. Basically, I want it all, and I want everybody else to have it all as well. I honestly feel like if we didn't have this masculine feminine thing going on, and while still recognizing that genders exist, if we stripped away all of that, we wouldn't have inequality anymore in genders, because there would be no way of putting inequality into the process. If everybody was treated absolutely the same and treated based on their relative strengths and weaknesses, then there wouldn't be an imbalance. And again, some traits are more prevalent in males or females, or depending on your testosterone levels or your size or your strength. But all of those things are kind of independent of the structures that we put them as part of. If I was trying to lift something heavy and there was someone stood next to me who was incredibly muscular and 6'4" and could lift it a lot easier, why would there need to be this definition of the label for that person who's lifting it? Can't we just say they are stronger than me and therefore they can lift it? And like nail varnish, for example. So you might be able to see if you're watching the video that I am wearing nail varnish. And I started wearing nail varnish about a year ago. And I did it because I realized that nobody told me that I couldn't. As a man, identifying as a male, there is nothing on any of the nail varnish bottles that says this is only for females or it will melt your nails if you are male. And for me, rather than it being about gender, about it being feminine to wear nail varnish, I like the colour. I like being able to look down and see shiny colours on my nails. It makes me happy. So I'm willing to push against the societal norm of nail varnish being a feminine thing because of the benefit that I get from wearing coloured nail varnish. But I still kind of feel like it would be better if we didn't have a masculine or feminine attached to nail varnish. If anybody was allowed to wear anything they wanted, to express themselves however they wanted, based on how comfortable that made them feel and how happy it made them feel to do the thing. I'm aware that I'm getting quite ranty, but I would really love if someone could comment or message me about any perceived benefit that they see of still holding these labels and these ideas in place. Again, the community aspect is the only one that I can think of that would draw people together and would allow a certain group of people to feel more comfortable in a surrounding. But even that, I feel when you get into the nuance of what we're actually talking about here, it's not lots of masculine people hanging around together. It's actually a few of those subsections that are joined together to make people more comfortable. So if you want to hang around with people who you want lots of banter with and you want to be a little bit physically aggressive, then those are the definitions that you need to put into your community. Those are the expressions of your community. It doesn't have to be labeled with this idea of, well, these are masculine traits, therefore we are being masculine by doing this. Or at least to me, it doesn't. And then I think about how the media perpetuates this idea of masculinity, creates this idea of hyper-masculine being at one end of the spectrum through all of the superhero movies and all of the unrealistic body images for men of having huge, great big muscles and being really strong and being completely emotionally detached and being able to shoot people point blank and beat people up in order to prove how masculine they are. And all of these tropes glorify the idea of power and dominance and competition. And I think this stuff has a massive mental health implication onto a lot of young men and boys. I know that I was definitely impacted by that growing up, this idea that as a boy I had to be masculine in as many ways as possible in order to defend myself. And I wasn't allowed to be emotional, and I had to look a certain way, and I had to be a certain way in order to be the hyper masculine version of myself. And I think at school there's a lot of linking that masculinity with gender and then also sexuality. Again, this idea that if you were feminine, then you must be homosexual. And although I'm hoping that that's drifted away a little bit now and everybody understands that whether or not you are attracted to men or women has nothing to do with how masculine or feminine you are, I still feel like that's something that I'm trying to actively counteract and fight against as a societal influence on me personally, to be able to express myself through singing and dancing and the way that I look and what I wear as a heterosexual male, but not have that narrative in my head from growing up in a school where if you are feminine, then you must be gay. Again, I want my kids to be able to grow up and be able to express themselves however they want, regardless of their gender or their sexuality or any other attribute that they may have. I want them to be able to express themselves and feel comfortable in themselves without having to adhere to a masculine or feminine, or even having to put things in a bracket of masculine or feminine and then work out whether or not they can do these things based on those labels. And then there's all of the extra stuff that comes in from the media around the dumb dad narrative, this idea that dads aren't allowed to be emotional, they're not allowed to be competent parents, they're always a little bit inept. And I think Bluey is an amazing counterbalance to that in modern society. And I'm really glad that that's getting the attention that it deserves. But everywhere else you look, there's a reason that we deliberately made sure that our kids didn't watch Peppa Pig. And it's because the dad in that show is completely incompetent. And it sets a really poor example for what men and boys are allowed to be when it comes to parenting, that we didn't really want to expose our kids to that perception of the world. And then the other reason that masculinity is coming up, and the word masculinity is coming up a lot in the media at least, is because of this thread of toxic masculinity, which seems to be running through communities. And again, Andrew Tate is a big name within that space, but the idea that men have to be men, they have to follow all of these outdated ideas of what masculinity is, and that I think from reading into it, his main message is we should just go back to the 1950s. It was a lot easier for men to be men in the 1950s, and everybody should be subjugated. All of the women should be subjugated in order to make it easier for men. And if you can't tell from my tone, I am obviously completely against that message. I think it's ridiculous and doesn't make any sense. But trying to see the counter argument, I do understand why people are being drawn into it. And I think it's because it offers a quick fix. I think what I'm suggesting is completely destroying the whole idea of masculine or feminine within societal expression. And that is a really long-term, very complicated project with lots of additional nuance and lots of disempowerment before you get to the place of bringing everybody up to the same level. And I think what Andrew Tate and people like that are creating is this idea of a quick solution. If everything just went back to the way that it was, then everything would be better for people like me. And people like me is people like you, and that's why people connect with that message. Because while we frame things as masculine or feminine, and while we are trying to push everything up to equality, which is an absolutely right thing to do, and in order to do that, all of the feminine ideals which have been pushed down need to be brought up to the level. All of the gender inequality that exists needs to be destroyed. And that normally means bringing women up to the same level as men. And so men are obviously going to feel like they're stagnating because everybody else is moving and they're staying where they are to make sure everything is balanced. But I think that's necessary in order to make sure that everybody gets an equal chance. Everybody is seen fairly and equally based on their merits rather than on the gender that they were born with, or the gender that they identify as, or whether or not they're masculine or feminine. This idea of being an alpha exists within mammals, but it doesn't have to exist within a more developed and evolved society. The other thing that I think really draws people into that toxic masculinity idea is the fact that there are a lot of men out there at the moment who are struggling and don't feel like there is a place for them to express their struggles. So I've heard this expressed quite well elsewhere, But I think it completely makes sense as an idea that while we have to bring everybody up to the same level, one of the ways that that can potentially happen is by shutting down any of the complaints or struggles of the people at the top of the pyramid. And again, this is the difference between generalized populations and individuals. So generalized populations, absolutely more men are at the top of that pyramid. They are benefiting from the patriarchy. They are benefiting from having a lot more advantages. And I am part of that because I am a white heterosexual male. I get all of those advantages and I see all of those biases that I am getting as an advantage. And yet, on an individual level, men exactly like me can still feel disempowered, can still feel like they don't have a place to go if they're struggling, and if they need to complain, if things aren't going right for them, if they are somehow not able to achieve all of the things that they think they should be able to achieve with all of these advantages that they get. There's an idea that they can't complain about it because they've already got all of these advantages. And so I think overall, from what I see, and again, my media stream is probably quite biased in terms of the things that I watch and therefore the things that I see. I don't see a lot of toxic masculine content because I would never click on it. But I do feel like we are slowly moving in the right direction with being able to redefine masculinity as a positive thing, as a thing that can incorporate all of these extra ideas of being a more balanced and rational human being and not having to fit into a small subset of these labels. And I think some of the ways that that's happening is obviously through the emotional intelligence side of things, through shifting our ideas from external to internal validation. And that means removing the idea of power and wealth and influence as markers of success, of markers of competence, which again are highly linked with this idea of masculinity in some way. And then there's this switch from toxic pride to healthy pride. So the way that this is defined as toxic pride is superiority, ego, and dominance, whereas healthy pride is more humility, self-growth, and community. And again, healthy masculinity could be defined as a balanced approach to all of the generic ideas of masculinity, plus all of these new ideas of emotional awareness, emotional intelligence, creativity, curiosity, balance. But when I say all of that out loud, isn't that just being a human? Isn't being able to tap into any of those individual parts and not have to label them as masculine or feminine while we're doing it a much better place to be than creating this idea of masculine or feminine and then having to somehow subvert ourselves into different categories and challenge gender roles and gender assumptions in order to allow us to be feminine at one point and masculine at another. I think one of the other things that I heard when it was talking about the ideas for why this toxic masculinity thing is growing in appeal to certain groups is the idea that men have somehow lost their shorthand for what they can be proud of. Masculine in itself used to be really easy to define, like providing for your family and having a good job. And while we still link the idea of masculinity with those ideals, some of those things don't exist anymore, or they do, but they are also available to everybody else, which again is absolutely the right point. You should be completely able to provide for your family regardless of your gender or whether you're masculine or feminine. But it does leave a vacuum. It does leave this idea that up to now, a certain proportion of men have found pride in those things and are now finding it more difficult to find pride in the same things. And I think everybody wants to feel valued. Everybody wants to feel like the things that they do make a difference, that there is a place for them within the world. If I think about whether or not, for me personally, I would rather tie that to a label and then try and adhere to that label, or whether I would rather find pride in the individual things that I was doing, whether that is getting a promotion at work, providing for my family, or just being a competent and aware parent to my children. All of those things should be seen equally, and I should take as much pride out of being an active parent as I should out of getting a promotion at work. It all comes down to our values and our ideas of what creates value that we then take pride in. If we truly understand what's important to us, then we do those things well, then those are the things that we're going to take pride in. But we have to shut out all of the external noise around what society expects us to take pride in and what society expects us to be good at, in order to focus internally on our values and our beliefs and the things that we hold as most important. So I feel like I'm a broken record, but when it comes to actionable steps for redefining these things, at least on a personal level, obviously journaling, meditation, gratitude, understanding yourself and your values and your ideas and what's really important to you is going to be critical to the idea of dropping away this idea of having to conform to a certain set of social standards. I think emotional intelligence is something that I'm only learning now and will continue to learn throughout the rest of my life. Being able to embrace the emotional intelligence that comes with that is still very difficult. I can be aware of how I feel and I can still not feel like I am able to express that because of the societal expectations of what it is to be masculine or feminine and to cry or be sad or be angry. I think stereotypically there has only been a few emotions that men have been allowed to share in society. So things like being stoic or being angry are fine, but things like struggling, being vulnerable, have never been acceptable within this framework of masculinity. And so I think it's pushing against that every day, pushing against the idea of, is this idea coming from an outdated framework for what I consider to be masculine and the way that I want to look, the way that I want to be perceived by society? Or am I able to lean into what's important to me? And again, for me, I want to break the cycle of this with my children. With my two boys, I want them to be able to be completely emotionally competent, to have a full range of emotions and be able to express them and understand them in themselves as they grow up. And so it's very important for me to do the work to tap into all of those things and also to show them that I can express all of those emotions. Because if they don't see their role models, their male and masculine role models, displaying these traits, then they'll never believe that it's okay for them to show them. Therapy is obviously a key one, therapy and coaching. Again, there is an element of vulnerability that you have to lean into when you're talking about therapy and coaching. But admitting that that is a place for you to grow rather than a place that you go when you have weakness is a massive mindset shift. The way that I see therapy is very much like most people see a personal trainer in the gym. If you wanted to work out and you wanted to exercise better, you wouldn't expect to just walk into a gym and understand how all of the equipment worked. You wouldn't be able to immediately create an incredible program for you to keep advancing and understanding exactly what was going on a physiological level. And yet we assume that we should be able to do that on a mental level. without anybody to help guide us through these incredibly complicated ideas and all of the layers of everything that we've built up over time. And so if I frame the idea of therapy and coaching as not a weakness, someone needs to help me because I'm being vulnerable, but instead as a, I want to grow and create a better version of myself. And there are people out there who have studied and practiced how to do this, and I should go and get an expert's help. I think that makes it a lot more accessible for me and hopefully for other people listening who have previously struggled with the idea of using therapy as a tool. And I think this doesn't just matter to the men and the masculinity. I think redefining these terms or getting rid of these terms altogether could be beneficial for the entirety of society. It would enable the feminine parts of us to be as free as the masculine parts. It would mean that anybody could access any of these parts and feel free to do it without a stigma attached to the way that that's seen by society. I think it would encourage diversity over an entire spectrum, over an entire range. I think it would balance out all of the gender equality. But everybody would have to be comfortable letting go of those labels and letting go of the idea that you can still be a female, but you don't have to be all feminine. And possibly, I was talking to my wife about this idea, and she is definitely going down a journey at the moment where feminine is starting to mean really positive things. It's meaning power and strength and realizing how important and how incredible the female body is. And I wouldn't want to take any of that away by getting rid of the idea of femininity. But again, I think my point is that you don't need the label of feminine to be able to display any of the traits as a human that you feel comfortable, that you feel like you want to portray. So I think in closing, the summary that I've come to is that it's more important for me to break down the label of masculinity and take from it all of the parts that I want to display, and then break down the label of femininity and take all of those parts that I want to display, and not worry about which bucket these things fall into, but actually just to take a moment to express myself, how I feel like would make me happiest and make me most comfortable and make me the best version of me that I am without having to adhere to any label. And I think the more I think about it, the more the label is the problem. The more a set group of characteristics defined by society, which you're meant to live up to, is a completely flawed notion, which is always going to leave people feeling isolated or different to a generic norm of people who are also probably masking some of their feminine traits because we all have them. But I think we also need to work out where community comes from and where new communities can come from if we're getting rid of these labels. We still need to find places where people can feel safe to be themselves, surrounded by their peers, surrounded by people like them, where they are encouraged and championed for the people that they are and not for the people that they're pretending to be. And I think if we can group people by other communities, if people can fall into other subsets where they feel comfortable and they feel like they belong, then maybe there will be less need for these masculine and feminine labels within our society. I think if we can do all of that, then we'll create a society which is much richer, much more diverse, much more accepting of everybody's individual character traits and how they can benefit themselves and also society as a whole. And that will create a healthier and more inclusive world for everybody. So that's my mission statement. I'll take that away and action that and let you know by next week how successful it's been. As always, I'd be really interested to hear your individual commentary on this. I'd be really interested to know whether or not you feel like I've missed something, or there is something about these terms that are really important to you that you would define in a different way than I've defined them. Or if you completely agree with everything I say, then also let me know that, so I know that I'm not completely on my own. And with that, I'll say thank you for listening and take care.